Welcome to Poetic Technique. Today's topic will be the genre of poetry known as the dramatic monologue. Before we get to the good stuff, let's look at a few of the conventions of the genre. You should expect a dramatic monologue to have a single identifiable speaker. That speaker may be a historic or a famous figure, anyone from Ulysses to Marilyn Monroe, whose story would be well known to a general readership. Or that speaker might instead be an unknown figure. In the latter case, one of the ambitions of the dramatic monologue is to paint a sufficient psychological portrait of the speaker, such that we can understand who they are and what they're liable to do outside of the present moment of the poem. In the former case, the famous figure should experience some significant and noticeable change. Monroe's death might be an example. Next, the dramatic monologue needs an addressee. This can be and is often an implied audience. It could be the intended recipient of the monologue, as in an epistle. Whoever the addressee is, however, they should be complicated by the stakes of the poem. There is no drama, after all, unless something is at stake. The next aspect we might expect to see is a specific occasion for the poem. This might be, as with Ulysses from our packet, a hero's desire for one last adventure, his summoning the troops, summoning the mariners to get up and get going with him one last time. Or it might be, as with Portfurious Lover, a man's having just killed his beloved, speaking with her recently deceased head as it cools and rests on his shoulder. Whatever it may be, the occasion must be made clear by the poem itself. An additional aspect previously touched on but repeated here for emphasis, in the case that the speaker of the poem is not a well-known figure, and often in cases when they are, some self-revelation is typically characteristic of the genre. We learn from what is said what has happened or will happen after the poem ends. Which brings me to my final point. A dramatic monologue very often, though not always, ends with what we might call a loaded gun. What this means is simply the gun has not yet gone off, but we are led to believe that it will, immediately or very shortly after the poem ends. So to recap, there's an identifiable speaker written in persona. They might be historical, fictive, or archetypal, typically well known to the reader, or developed somehow in the body of the poem itself. Second, there's a specific addressee. This could be an individual, a group, or an implied audience. Third, there's some element of irony in the poem, often a dramatic irony, where we know something, or as the reader, that the speaker of the poem might not. Next, there is some form of self-revelation, especially in the vein of Robert Browning's dramatic monologues, where he doesn't rely on famous figures. A lot of the psychology of the speaker of the poem is revealed in what they say in the poem itself. Again, there is an occasion for the poem. It is on the verge of a significant action, and this brings us to the loaded gun, which is we end right before the big thing happens. That's part of the drama of the poem. Now let's get to the good stuff. If we look at I's poem from Vice, New and Selected Poems, the poem called Nothing But Color, we'll be able to identify a few of these conventions. Now, it's a hard poem, so I'm going to spend some time breaking it down a little bit. Nothing But Color, for Yukio Mishima. I didn't write Atsuko. I sliced her open. She was carmine inside, like a sea bass, and empty. No viscera, nothing but color. I love you like that, boy. I pull the kimono down around your shoulders and kiss you, then you let it fall open. Each time I cut you a little, and when you leave, I take the piece, broil it, dip it in ginger sauce, and eat it. It burns my mouth so. You laugh, holding me belly down with your body. So much hurting to get to this moment when I'm beneath you, wanting it to go on and to end. At midnight you say, "See you tonight," and I answer, "There won't be any tonight." But you just smile, swing your sweater over your head and tie the sleeves around your neck. I hear you whistling long after you disappeared on the subway steps as I walk back home, my whole body tingling. I undress and put the bronze sword on my desk beside the crumpled sheet of rice paper. I smooth it open and read its single sentence, "I meant to do it." No, it should be common and feminine, like "I can't go on sharing him," or something to imply that. Or the truth, that I saw in myself the 5 signs of the decay of the angel, and you were holding on, watching and free. That I decided to go out with the pungent odor of this cold and consuming passion in my nose, death. Now I've said it. that vulgar word that drags us down to the worm's sightless, predestined. God damn you, boy. Nothing I said mattered to you. That bullshit about Etsuko or about killing myself. I tear the note, then burn it. The alarm clock goes off, 5:45 a.m. I take the sword and walk into the garden. I look up. The sun, the moon, two round teeth rock together, and the light of one chews up the other. I stab myself in the belly. Wait, then stab myself again. It's snowing. I'll turn to ice, but I'll burn anyone who touches me. I start pulling my guts out, those red silk cords spiraling skyward, and I'm climbing them past the moon and the sun, past darkness, into white. I mean to live. The first thing that we notice is, as mentioned, the poem is written in the first person singular, and it begins with a statement of what the speaker did not do. She did not write Etsuko. What did she do? She sliced her open. Well, we don't know who the speaker is, not yet, and not by the end of the poem. At least it's not a historical figure. What we do know is that we're inside her mind. What we're told is, right at the get-go, the impossible. That the speaker has sliced open a woman that she found was red and empty, just color inside. If we wonder whether we're supposed to be reading this literally, we can just turn to the next part that ends the simile, which is, I love you like that boy. I refuses to specify the part of the simile that's attached to that ambiguous pronoun referent that. She loves him like what exactly? Like a hollow corpse with no viscera? Like the act of slicing someone open? Like both? She continues that each time the addressee of this poem, her beloved, leaves her, she cuts a little piece of him off, broils it in ginger, eats it. She describes this in such visceral, violent terms that the average reader is probably going to be a little bit disturbed by the poem. If they weren't disturbed by the first few lines, they're certainly going to be disturbed by the idea of a lover cutting pieces off of her beloved's body and broiling them in ginger. The visceral quality of these descriptions characterizes this speaker's tendency toward the dramatic, toward hyperbole, and also highlights her emotional state in the poem as being of paramount importance to the poem's occasion. As it continues, the speaker writes this letter on a sheet of rice paper and then corrects herself, saying her message should be something more feminine, something like, quote, I couldn't go on sharing you. And then she concludes this notion with, or the truth that I saw in myself the 5 signs of the decay of the angel. Well, what? Well, even after reading this poem, even after figuring out who its unreliable speaker is, when she can be trusted to tell the truth, what she's done, or at least what she's trying to communicate, your job still isn't done. Instead, you have to explore the epigraph a little bit. And what you find out is this phrasing comes from Mishima's own literature. The signs of the decay of the angel, in addition to being a super musical phrase, is also elusive. It adds elements of meaning through its intertextuality. It's additionally complex in this way. If the poem is addressed to someone who writes about the decay of the angel and the speaker uses that language in who she addresses, then what's the relationship of the speaker to the poet herself? Complicated questions, sure. At first, when I read this poem, I thought it was written to, I thought Etsuko was Mishima's wife. I did more research and nerded out in this poem and found out that Etsuko was actually Mishima's sister. So what makes this speaker's already compelling psychology even more complex is that she says she can't go on sharing this lover even with his sister. Wow. For the sake of the time, we're going to move to the final action and final line of the poem. In the last action, the speaker of the poem commits seppuku. Going into her garden, she takes a sword, opens herself up by the stomach, then climbs her entrails to the moon. Again, we don't know when we're reading these lines at first whether we're supposed to interpret this seppuku as literal or as figurative. But of course, a person can't actually climb their own entrails to the moon, so did the speaker commit suicide? Well, to answer this question, we can look at the very last line, which is, I mean to live. What? The speaker has committed murder, but not committed murder. She's committed suicide, but not committed suicide. So what does it mean for her to end with the statement, I mean to live? Well, we turn back to the occasion of the poem. The speaker is having an affair. The man is unavailable to her. At first, she says that she didn't write a letter to his sister, which means she previously claimed she did write a letter, or maybe threatened one. In the first few lines, she revises herself. I didn't do that. What did I do? I slice her open. Okay, so she didn't write the letter, so we can assume she didn't actually slice Atsuko open either. And if we have any question, we can turn to the speaker herself, who says, nothing I said mattered to you. That bullshit about Atsuko, or... So she didn't kill Atsuko. She didn't write a letter. She didn't carve off pieces of her lover, and we can gather she probably didn't kill herself. What did she do? She imagined each. In the occasion of the poem, she found herself in an impossible conflict. She's in love with a man who is unavailable to her, so she imagines possible resolutions. The simplest description of this poem's occasion might be something like, loving you is killing me. But that would be really boring, so the alternatives are what she imagines instead. And what's the smoking gun of the poem? Well, if loving this man is killing her, then she must kill the life that she knew in order to have a new one, in order to have one that's worth living. So she commits an honor suicide, one that absolves her of her failures, and so finds the only solution that she can imagine, which is quitting the life she knows and starting over. An additional aspect to know about this poem is that Mishima, in addition to being a finalist for the Nobel Prize, I think twice, was also an activist, and he committed seppuku as a way to end his life and protest for the way that the government was treating his people. So there are multiple ways that Ai takes a speaker, someone who is in love with this person that she admires. Now, whether Ai actually had any sort of real relationship with Mishima doesn't matter. What does matter is that she's created a speaker that develops a sort of unrequited or unrequitable relationship with him. And she imagines her way out of the problems of the present scenario. Now, I've talked a whole lot about one poem, and I'm supposed to be establishing the outline for this genre as a whole. The good news is the poem that we just talked about cuts across a lot of boundaries. Moving forward, if we look back in time, we can see where she draws some of her influences. We see Ai's contemporaries operate also in different personae. Louise Glick speaks from the perspectives of seasons and of flowers. Her poems often don't end with a loaded gun, but they do end with a bang. And what I mean by this is she develops and she explores the individual speaker's psychologies through multiple manifestations in such a way that each poem teaches or evokes or reaches some sort of epiphany about what it means to be them. In another imagined vein, Sharon Olds' poems include My Father Speaks to Me from the Dead, which is the final poem in her book-length Elegy to Father. And in this poem, her dead father describes waking up in the dirt and pulling the cobwebs off his orifices, and then praises the things that he loved about his daughter. The dramatic tension here is contained in the fact of the poet imagining her father's affections after his death, affections that he failed to communicate while living. And so the loaded gun of this poem is deeply emotional. It says, "For human love, go elsewhere." Even in death, even in this poem's attempt to imagine the father speaking affection, it can't imagine that sort of affection, that sort of basic human love. So let's flip to Portfurious Lover by Robert Browning. Porphyria's Lover. The rain set early in tonight. The sullen wind was soon awake. It tore the elm tops down for spite and did its worst to vex the lake. I listened with heart fit to break. When glided in Porphyria, straight she shut the cold out and the storm, and kneeled and made the cheerless grate blaze up and all the cottage warm. Which done, she rose, and from her form withdrew the dripping cloak and shawl, and laid her soiled gloves by, untied her hat, and let the damp hair fall, and, last, she sat down by my side and called me. When no voice replied, she put my arm about her waist, and made her smooth white shoulder bare, and all her yellow hair displaced, and stooping, made my cheek lie there, and spread o'er all her yellow hair, murmuring how she loved me, she, too weak for all her heart's endeavor, to set its struggling passion free from pride, and vainer ties dissever, and give herself to me forever. But passion sometimes would prevail, nor could tonight's gay feast restrain a sudden thought of one so pale for love of her, and all in vain. So she was come through wind and rain. Be sure I looked up at her eyes, happy and proud. At last I knew Porphyria worshipped me. Surprise made my heart swell, and still it grew while I debated what to do. That moment she was mine, fair, perfectly pure and good. I found a thing to do, and all her hair in one long yellow string I wound 3 times her little throat around and strangled her. No pain felt she. I am quite sure she felt no pain. As a shut bud that holds a bee, I warily oped her lids again, laughed the blue eyes without a stain. And I untightened next the tress about her neck, her cheek once more blushed bright beneath my burning kiss. I propped her head up as before, only this time my shoulder bore her head, which droops upon it still, the smiling rosy little head, so glad it has its utmost will, that all it scorned at once is fled, and I, its love, am gained instead. Porphyria's love, she guessed not how her darling one wish would be heard, and thus we sit together now, and all night long we have not stirred, and yet God has not said a word. Okay, so what do we make of that? Well, one of the things that I've already mentioned is that in Browning's approach to the dramatic monologue, he's interested in abnormal psychology. Certainly there is a significant occasion that happens in this poem, right? So if there is drama to this, well, we can see it in a sort of loaded gun, absolutely. What happens after the moment of this poem? What happens after this terrifying thing? But also in the dramatic irony, the difference between what we know of this speaker and the way that he's describing himself. And let's think also about the way that the speaker of this poem relays information. It's not like he's in this moment. He's moving step by step. He's telling things as they happened, more or less. Of course, we have a past tense poem, but it's moving narratively from one moment to the next. Now, soon I'm going to be asking you to try your own hand at a dramatic monologue. And what I would ask you to do is run closer in the vein of the Tennyson type of poem, where you choose a figure that is historical or a very famous figure. Again, writing either laterally or upward vertically on the ladder of privilege. The things I want you to focus on are going to be detailed in the assignment description, but as you think about this genre and as you read or reread these poems, look at the ways that narratively each of these speakers communicates something significant about their being, so that we don't just have action. The poem is not just about the tension of what is going to happen, but also who is telling the story and to whom it's being told contributes to why that's significant. That's all I'm going to say about dramatic monologue for now. Again, some of these poems in the packet are not dramatic monologues. They are simply persona poems, but each of them has something to teach you about moving into the psychology of someone other than the self, being intentional about crafting those psychologies. That's it for now.